Welcome to LinesToGo installation videos. Today we will be replacing brake lines on a 2013 Mercedes S550 using LinesToGo part number BLMB-104-SS. While this particular installation is being performed on a 2013 S550, this set of lines will also fit the following year, make, and models as shown on your screen now. LinesToGo lines are made using original equipment end forms and fittings that are CNC bent for an easy and precise installation. We have also upgraded to stainless steel braided Teflon hoses for rust protection and to prevent surface fouling. These have an unlimited shelf life and anti-static PTFE liner. This set of LinesToGo lines are made using 304L stainless steel for rust resistance that exceeds OEM standards. Tech tip: disconnect the battery before working on a vehicle to reduce the risk of shorting out the battery on tools or lines. LinesToGo lines are made with a sectional design for easier installation. We also use color-coded unions on our sectioned lines. Just match the colors at the connections. Tools required: E10, 8mm, 10mm, 13mm, and 17mm sockets and ratchet, 10mm, 11mm, 12mm, and 13mm wrenches, pliers and cutting pliers, pick or flat blade screwdriver, tubing cutter, double flare brake line flaring tool, drain pan, jack and jack stands. The level of difficulty for this installation is considered to be hard. Please note, this kit requires you to flare 3 brake lines. The right front line is a complete replacement, however the 2 rear lines and the left front line are partial lines that replace the common trouble areas where the lines are exposed to the elements and corrode. This is a relatively involved installation, however replacing all of the lines as complete lines would be extremely difficult. This kit requires the use of a small tubing cutter and a double flare brake line flaring kit. Start by disconnecting the negative battery terminal using a 10mm wrench. We will start with the rear brake lines. This will allow you to practice flaring brake lines before it is required on the vehicle. Lift up in the front corners of the rear seat cushion to disconnect it from the vehicle. Pull the bottom cushion forward, being careful of the 2 electrical connectors that are connected at the rear. Use a 13mm socket to remove the nut at the center that supports the fuel tank. Raise and support the vehicle and remove all 4 wheels using a 17mm socket. Use an 8mm socket to remove the bolts that secure the plastic lower cover underneath the transmission. Use an 8mm and a 10mm socket to remove the nuts that secure the fabric cover on the passenger side of the vehicle. Use an E10 socket to remove the 2 bolts that secure the passenger side of the fuel tank. This will allow the fuel tank to lower down about an inch to let you route the lines around the tank. Use a pick or screwdriver to remove the lines from the plastic clips beside the fuel tank. Take your new rear LinesToGo lines labeled 05A and 06A and hold them into position, making sure the bends are lined up, and mark the lines on the vehicle where the new lines end. Cut both rear lines a few inches behind the marks you made using a pair of cutting pliers. Cut the 2 rear lines in front of the fuel tank and remove the forward sections. Remove the rear lines from the clips located above the rear subframe. Use an 11mm wrench to remove the threaded fitting at the right rear flex hose. There is not much room to lift the line out of the fitting, so you may need to pull the flex hose down. Cut the right rear line in front of the fuel filler pipe using a pair of cutting pliers and remove the short section. Remove the final section of the right rear brake line from the vehicle. Use an 11mm wrench to remove the threaded fitting at the left rear flex hose. Cut the left rear brake line at the passenger side of the subframe near the rear fuel tank bolt. Remove the rearmost section of the left rear brake line from the vehicle. Remove the final section of the left rear brake line from around the fuel tank and above the subframe. We found twisting the line slightly once it is hanging helped with the removal process. With the rear brake lines removed, we suggest you use a straight section of one of the lines removed to practice cutting and flaring lines before doing it on the vehicle where the line length needs to be accurate. Place the tubing cutter with the cutting wheel lined up with the mark and tighten the clamping knob slightly. Turn the cutter around the line a few times and tighten the knob more. Repeat until you cut through the line. Install the brake line fitting onto the line and install the cut line into the flare bar and set the length that sticks out using the flaring die and tighten the clamps. Install the flaring yoke with the flaring die onto the bar and tighten the screw until the die bottoms out on the bar. Unscrew the yoke and remove the die. Tighten the yoke once more without the first die to make the inner taper and then remove the line from the clamp. Repeat these steps a few times until you feel comfortable with the process and are getting a good quality flare. Cut the rear lines on the mark made earlier and install the new supplied fittings onto the lines and flare both lines. To begin the installation of your new rear LinesToGo brake lines, start by installing the front section of the left rear brake line labeled 05A into position. Secure the line into the plastic clips. Connect the new line to the original line that was cut furthest forward on the vehicle using the supplied union. Install the next section of the left rear LinesToGo brake line labeled 05B into position, routing it above the rear subframe and then around the fuel tank. Connect the two lines using the supplied union noting the LinesToGo color-coded connection. Secure the line into the plastic clips above the rear subframe. Next, install the final section of the left rear LinesToGo brake line labeled 05C into position, routing it over the rear subframe. Start the rear fitting into the left rear flex hose. Connect the lines together using the supplied union noting the color-coded connection. Tighten the fitting in the flex hose using a 12mm wrench. Tighten the three unions using a 10mm and a 13mm wrench. Next, install the front section of the right rear LinesToGo brake line labeled 06A into position and connect it to the original section of the right rear line using the supplied union. Install the next section of the right rear LinesToGo brake line labeled 06B into position, routing it over the rear subframe and around the fuel tank. Connect the two sections of line using the supplied union noting the LinesToGo color-coded connection. Install the final section of the right rear line labeled 06C into position, routing it above the fuel filler pipe. Connect the two sections of line using the supplied union noting the LinesToGo color-coded connection. Start the rear fitting into the right rear flex hose and tighten using a 12mm wrench. Tighten the three unions using a 10mm and a 13mm wrench. Using an E10 socket, tighten the two bolts on the passenger side of the fuel tank. Tighten the nut at the center of the rear seat using a 13mm socket. If the locking clips for the seat cushion stayed in the body, carefully remove it, making sure not to drop it down inside the body panels. Install the clips back onto the latches at the bottom of the seat. Replace the rear seat cushion and line up the front clips and push down to secure the seat. Replace the rear lower cover using an 8mm and a 10mm socket. Replace the front lower cover using an 8mm socket. At the passenger side front of the vehicle, remove the electrical connector from the coolant surge tank. Use a 10mm socket to remove the nut that secures the coolant surge tank. Lift up on the tank to move it out of the way. There is a tube still connected at the bottom of the tank. We tied the tank out of the way during this process. Use an 11mm wrench to remove the top 3 fittings on the driver's side of the ABS module, along with the rear fitting on the driver's side of the module. We are only replacing the right front line at the module, but the other lines need to be removed to route the line into position. Use an 11mm wrench to remove the threaded fitting from the top of the right front flex hose. Remove the right front brake line from the vehicle. To begin the installation of your new right front LinesToGo brake line, install the line labeled 04 into position. Start the top fitting into the top passenger side central port in the ABS module. Start the bottom fitting into the top of the right front flex hose and tighten both fittings using a 12mm wrench. Replace the remaining fittings back into the ABS module and tighten using an 11mm wrench. Reposition the coolant surge tank and secure it using a 10mm socket. Replace the electrical connector on top of the tank. Next, remove the weather stripping from behind the engine. Remove the plastic wiring harness pass-through bracket. Remove the electrical connector from the top of the master cylinder. Carefully remove the large vacuum tube and one-way valve from the brake booster. Remove the small tube from the one-way valve that was in the brake booster. You can now reposition the large vacuum tube off to the side. Use a 12mm wrench to remove the 2 threaded fittings from the master cylinder and position the lines off to the side. Use a 13mm socket to remove the 2 nuts that secure the master cylinder to the brake booster. Remove the master cylinder and front support bracket from the vehicle. We will be connecting the new line to the original left front brake line in the space underneath the master cylinder. Use an 11mm wrench to remove the threaded fitting from the top of the left front flex hose. Use a pair of cutting pliers to cut the right front brake line at the grommet inside of the strut tower. Remove the short section of the left front brake line from the vehicle. Install the new left front LinesToGo brake line labeled 03 into position and start the threaded fitting into the flex hose by hand. We are installing the new line into position so you can mark where to cut the original line. You can remove the original line from the plastic clip and pull it out of the rubber grommet. Mark where the new line ends on the original line. This should be located behind the small bend that is close to the grommet. You can twist the original line so that it is pointed upwards to complete the next few steps. This is a tight space to work in, so be careful during the flaring process to take your time so you end up with a good quality flare. Cut the line on the mark made. Install the new supplied brake line fitting onto the original line. Use a double flare brake line flaring tool to flare the original section of line. Connect the new and original sections of the left front brake line using the supplied union and tighten using a 10mm and a 13mm wrench. Tighten the fitting in the flex hose using a 12mm wrench. Install the master cylinder along with the front support bracket back into position. Secure the master cylinder using a 13mm socket to tighten the two nuts. Replace the primary and secondary brake lines and tighten the fittings using a 12mm wrench. Reconnect the small tube to the one-way valve and install it into the vacuum booster. Replace the plastic wiring harness bracket. Reconnect the electrical connector on top of the master cylinder. Replace the weather stripping at the rear of the engine. Bleed all four wheels using an 8mm and a 10mm wrench, making sure to keep the master cylinder reservoir topped up with fluid. Replace all four wheels and torque to your manufacturer's recommended torque spec using a 17mm socket. Reconnect the negative battery terminal using a 10mm socket. This concludes the installation of stainless steel brake lines on a 2012 Mercedes S550 using LinesToGo part number BLMB-104-SS. Thanks so much for watching. If you have any questions or would like to purchase the lines you saw today, please call us at 1-855-781-5992, email us at info@linestogo.com, or check out our website link below. Don't forget to take advantage of our free next day shipping. Don't forget to hit the like and subscribe button below, and we will see you in our next video.